At 1500 hours on June 7, 1944, the wheat fields south of Authie erupted in fire and steel. A wall of flame and smoke rose across the Norman countryside as concealed German guns opened fire from 3 directions at once. Canadian tankers watched in horror as Sherman after Sherman exploded into columns of orange fire, their crews scrambling to escape the infernos that had been their vehicles just seconds before. The thunderous boom of tank guns echoed across the plain. The ground shook with each detonation. The flat golden fields that had seemed so peaceful moments earlier transformed into a killing ground from which there was no escape. The men of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers had driven 5 miles inland from the Normandy beaches that morning, closer to the city of Caen than any Allied unit. They had fought through 2 villages, destroyed enemy guns, and pushed their advance to within sight of Carpiquet airfield. Now they were dying in the afternoon sun, caught in an ambush sprung by the most fanatical soldiers in the German army. Teenage SS troopers from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, many of them just 16 or 17 years old, had waited in perfect silence until the Canadians drove directly into their gun sights. Then they opened fire, and the wheat fields turned red with blood. Within minutes, the burning hulks of more than 20 Sherman tanks littered the fields between Authie and Franqueville. Canadian infantry scattered for cover that did not exist on the open ground. The screams of wounded men mixed with the crack of tank guns and the whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Black smoke from burning vehicles rose in thick columns against the blue summer sky. What had begun as an advance toward victory had become a desperate fight for survival. And for many of the Canadians who would fall into German hands that afternoon, the real horror was only beginning. The 27th Canadian Armoured Regiment had a proud history stretching back to the 19th century. Known as the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, the regiment drew its strength from the eastern townships of Quebec, a region of rolling green hills where English and French-speaking Canadians had lived side by side for generations. The men who filled its ranks came from small towns with names like Sherbrooke, Lennoxville, and Magog. They were factory workers and farmers, clerks and craftsmen, ordinary men who had answered their country's call when war came to Europe. The regiment had mobilized in 1940 and spent nearly 4 years training in Canada and England. They learned to operate the Sherman tank, mastering its controls, its weapons, and its limitations. They practiced formation maneuvers across English fields, preparing for the day when they would finally cross the Channel and take the fight to the enemy. By June of 1944, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers were as ready as any armoured unit could be. Their tanks were painted with the maple leaf of the Canadian Army, their crews eager to prove themselves in combat. The Sherman tank they crewed was a remarkable machine in many ways. It was reliable, relatively easy to maintain, and could be produced in enormous numbers by American factories. The Continental radial engine was essentially an aircraft power plant adapted for ground use, and it gave the 30-ton vehicle a respectable top speed of 25 miles per hour on roads. Its 75mm main gun was adequate against most targets, capable of firing both armor-piercing rounds and high-explosive shells for use against infantry and fortifications. The armor provided reasonable protection against small arms fire, shell fragments, and smaller anti-tank weapons. But the Sherman had a fatal weakness that its crews knew all too well. When hit by German anti-tank weapons, particularly the dreaded 88mm guns, the Sherman had a tendency to catch fire almost instantly. The gasoline engines and ammunition stored throughout the hull turned the vehicle into a death trap. The problem was exacerbated by the storage of ammunition in sponsons along the sides of the hull, directly in the path of incoming rounds. When these rounds were hit, the propellant charges would ignite, filling the interior with fire and toxic fumes within seconds. Crews had perhaps 10 to 15 seconds to escape before the entire vehicle became an inferno. German soldiers called it the Tommy Cooker, a grimly humorous reference to the way British and Canadian crews burned inside their machines. American crews called it the Ronson, after the lighter company whose advertising slogan was "Lights first time every time." Tank crews across the Allied armies developed a grim fatalism about their odds of survival. Statistics suggested that the average Sherman lasted only a few weeks in combat before being knocked out. The men of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers were about to learn why those statistics existed. Among the 63 tanks the regiment brought to Normandy were approximately 15 Firefly variants. These vehicles mounted the powerful British 17-pounder gun in place of the standard 75mm, giving them the ability to destroy any German tank at combat ranges. The Fireflies were the regiment's most valuable assets, typically commanded by junior officers who had received special training in their use. In the fighting to come, these tanks and their crews would prove their worth, but they would also become priority targets for German gunners who recognized the longer barrel of the 17-pounder. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders traced their lineage to the Highland settlements of Nova Scotia's northern counties. Founded in 1936 through the amalgamation of several militia units, the regiment drew its strength from communities scattered along the Atlantic coast. These were fishing villages and farming towns where life had always been hard, and where men learned early to work together against the challenges of an unforgiving land. Antigonish, Pictou, Colchester. These places had sent their sons to war before, and they would do so again. The regiment recruited heavily from the Gaelic-speaking communities that preserved the old Highland traditions brought by Scottish immigrants generations earlier. Many of the men still spoke the language of their ancestors. They carried the names Mackay, MacDonald, Fraser, and Campbell on their identity discs. When they marched to the sound of bagpipes. When they fought with the fierce determination their forebears had shown at Culloden and 100 battlefields before. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Petch commanded the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. A career soldier who had risen through the ranks, Petch was known as a demanding officer who pushed his men hard in training because he knew the alternative was watching them die for lack of preparation. He had earned their respect through years of shared hardship, and they would follow him into any fight. Petch believed his regiment was ready for what lay ahead. He would soon discover just how severe that test would be. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division had landed on Juno Beach the previous morning as part of the greatest amphibious invasion in history. June 6, 1944, the day the Allies returned to France, had been a triumph won at terrible cost. Thousands of young men from Canada, Britain, and the United States had stormed ashore against fortified German positions, fighting through minefields and machine gun fire to establish a foothold on the continent. The beaches had been cleared at bayonet point. The sea walls had been breached with explosives and raw courage. By nightfall, the beachheads were secure, but the objectives for the first day remained unfulfilled. Caen was supposed to fall on D-Day. The ancient Norman city sat at the junction of roads and railways that controlled access to the Falaise plain and ultimately to Paris itself. William the Conqueror had built 2 great abbeys there nearly 1,000 years earlier, and the medieval city centre still preserved much of its historic character. Capturing Caen would give the Allies a vital communications hub and deny the Germans a defensive anchor. The city's airfields, particularly Carpiquet to the west, would provide bases for fighter aircraft operating in support of the ground forces. But beach congestion, stubborn resistance, and the inevitable friction of war had slowed the advance. By the evening of June 6, Caen remained firmly in German hands, its medieval spires visible on the southern horizon but still miles beyond Allied reach. The task of resuming the advance fell to the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Douglas Cunningham. Known as the Highland Brigade, this formation included some of the finest soldiers Canada had sent to war. Besides the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, it contained the Highland Light Infantry of Canada from Galt and Waterloo, and the Stormont Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders from Ontario's eastern counties. These were men accustomed to hard work and harsh conditions, bound together by the close ties of small-town life where everyone knew everyone. Many had enlisted together, trained together, and now they would fight together. The force that assembled at Villon-les-Buissons on the morning of June 7 was impressive by any standard. Approximately 750 infantry from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders would advance alongside 63 Sherman tanks from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. Additional support came from machine gunners of the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, a troop of M10 tank destroyers with 17-pounder guns, and 2 forward observation officers who would call in artillery fire when needed. The fire support was supposed to include naval guns from ships offshore and field artillery from batteries near the beach. It was a combined arms force capable of handling almost any opposition. The plan called for an advance southward along the road toward Carpiquet Airfield. Reconnaissance tanks would lead, followed by infantry mounted on carriers and tanks. The formation would clear the villages of Les Buissons, Buron, and Authie before pushing on to seize the airfield. It seemed straightforward enough on the map. the reality would prove far more dangerous. At 0740 hours, the column moved out. The June morning was already warm, the sky clear and blue above the Norman countryside. Hedgerows lined the roads, their ancient growth marking boundaries between fields where wheat and barley ripened in the summer sun. Stone farmhouses with slate roofs dotted the landscape, their shutters closed against whatever violence might come. The smell of hay and wildflowers mixed with the diesel exhaust of the advancing tanks. French civilians watched from windows as the Canadian column rumbled past, uncertain whether to feel hope or fear at the sight of these liberators rolling toward the German lines. The first shots came at Les Buissons shortly before 0900 hours. An 88mm gun belonging to the 21st Panzer Division opened fire on the lead reconnaissance tank, sending it up in flames. The infantry dismounted and flanked the position, moving through ditches and behind hedgerows to approach the gun from the side. Grenades silenced the crew, and 3 half-tracks supporting the position were destroyed in the assault. By 0930 hours, Les Buissons was secure. The advance continued southward, the burning tank left behind as a marker of what was to come. Buron proved more difficult. The village was alive with snipers and machine guns, defended by remnants of multiple German formations, including troops from the 21st Panzer Division and the shattered 716th Infantry Division. These defenders had survived the D-Day bombardment and the initial landings. They knew the Allies were coming and had prepared their positions accordingly. Snipers fired from upper-story windows. Machine guns raked the streets from concealed positions in cellars and behind garden walls. Canadian infantry worked their way forward house by house, while Sherman tanks provided covering fire, their 75mm guns blasting suspicious windows and doorways. Major Mahon led B Squadron eastward toward Galmanche to suppress flanking fire that was pouring into the main column from the village of St. Contest. The move exposed his tanks to concealed German positions that had not yet revealed themselves. 3 Shermans from B Squadron were destroyed within minutes by a concealed 88mm gun, their crews killed or wounded before they could react. Major Mahon was among those lost, his tank brewing up in a ball of fire before anyone could escape. The commander of B Squadron was dead. Captain Bateman took over, pressing the attack with the 10 tanks that remained from his original 15. Canadian tankers destroyed another 88mm gun and 2 self-propelled guns as they fought their way into Buron. The fighting was close and brutal, with tanks firing at ranges of less than 100 yards. Infantry cleared buildings room by room, while tankers provided suppressing fire. The crack of rifles mixed with the boom of tank guns and the screams of wounded men. By approximately 1200 hours, Buron was declared secure. The vanguard had been fighting for over 4 hours and had advanced barely 2 miles. Lieutenant Colonel Petch arrived with his headquarters company and the 5 regimental headquarters tanks. His first priority was fire support. He immediately requested artillery fire on St. Contest, the fortified village to the east that had been pouring fire into B Squadron throughout the morning. The forward observation officer tried to raise the guns. The batteries were unavailable, out of range, or occupied with other missions. The naval forward observer attempted to contact HMS Belfast and her 9 6-inch guns offshore. No response. Radio problems plagued the operation throughout the day. Technical failures and the rapid pace of advance had severed the connection to the supporting arms. The vanguard was now operating without any artillery support. This absence would prove catastrophic. Artillery was the killing arm of modern warfare, capable of breaking up enemy concentrations before they could attack, suppressing defensive positions to allow infantry to advance, and covering withdrawing troops with a curtain of protective steel. The 24 guns of the 14th Field Regiment and the 9 6-inch guns of HMS Belfast represented enormous destructive power. Without them, the Canadians would have to rely entirely on their own tank guns and infantry weapons against whatever the Germans could throw at them. They pushed on regardless, unaware of what lay waiting in the fields ahead. Between 1200 hours and 1330 hours, the advance reached its maximum extent. 2 platoons from C Company cleared Authie house by house under Lieutenants Langley and Vaness, driving German defenders into the fire of B Squadron tanks positioned east of the village. The infantry worked methodically through the stone buildings, checking each room, neutralizing each position. French civilians emerged from cellars to greet their liberators, offering water and wine to the exhausted soldiers. For a brief moment, it seemed the objective was within reach. A squadron under Captain Sidney Radley Walters swept west of Authie and Franqueville, reaching positions where crews could see the hangars of Carpiquet airfield in the distance. The target they had been ordered to seize was visible through their periscopes, tantalizingly close. Radley Walters, a young officer from Montreal who would go on to become the Western Allies' leading tank ace, scored his first confirmed kill that day. His Firefly destroyed a Panzer IV at approximately 800 yards near Saint-Germain-la-Blanche-Herbe, the 17-pounder round punching clean through the German tank's armour. It was the first of 18 confirmed kills he would achieve before the war ended. Canadian carrier sections probed as far as Franqueville, the lead elements of the advance standing closer to Caen than any Allied soldier. From their positions, the crews could make out the medieval spires of the city rising above the plain. The smell of smoke from burning vehicles drifted on the warm afternoon air. Birds sang in the hedgerows despite the distant thunder of guns. The objective seemed within reach. What the Canadians could not see was that every move they made was being watched by hostile eyes from a tall stone tower barely 1,500 meters away. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had begun arriving outside Caen just after midnight on June 7th. The division was unique in the German order of battle. Created in 1943, it drew its enlisted ranks almost entirely from members of the Hitler Youth who had volunteered for service. These were boys of 16, 17, and 18 years old who had grown up under Nazi rule, educated in schools that taught racial superiority and militarism, trained in youth camps that emphasized physical fitness and ideological commitment. They had never known any world but the Third Reich, and they believed absolutely in the cause for which they fought. The division had trained intensively in Belgium and France during the winter and spring of 1944. The young volunteers learned infantry tactics, weapons handling, and the aggressive offensive doctrine that characterized German armoured units. They were taught that surrender was dishonor, that the enemy deserved no mercy, and that death in battle was the highest form of service to the fatherland. The indoctrination was thorough and effective. These boys were prepared to fight to the death and to show no quarter to those they defeated. Unlike regular Wehrmacht divisions, the Hitlerjugend did not issue alcohol or tobacco rations to its enlisted personnel. Instead, the young soldiers received extra rations of candy and chocolate. This detail, often noted by historians, reflected the youth of the division's rank and file. Many had never smoked a cigarette or tasted beer. They were children playing at war with real weapons, and the game was about to become terrifyingly real. The officers and non-commissioned officers who led these teenagers were a different breed entirely. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, survivors of years of brutal fighting against the Soviet Union. Many had served in the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, one of the most experienced and ruthless formations in the German military. These men had witnessed atrocities and committed them. They had grown accustomed to treating prisoners as obstacles to be eliminated rather than soldiers to be respected. When they took command of the Hitler Youth Volunteers, they brought that mentality with them. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer commanded the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, the division's lead element. Meyer was 33 years old, a true believer in National Socialist ideology, who had risen through the SS ranks through aggressive action and ruthless determination. He had fought in Poland, France, Greece, and Russia, earning a reputation for bold tactics that sometimes bordered on recklessness. His superiors valued him for his fighting spirit. His men feared and respected him in equal measure. He wore his Knight's Cross with oak leaves prominently at his throat, a visible symbol of his status as a warrior of the Reich. Meyer established his command post at the Abbaye d'Ardennes, a 12th-century Premonstratensian monastery in the commune of Saint-Germain-la-Blanche-Herbe. The medieval structure featured an imposing Gothic tower that rose high above the surrounding countryside, offering a panoramic view northward toward the English Channel. From this vantage point, Meyer could observe the entire Canadian advance as it developed. He watched the column move out from Vion-les-Buissons. He saw the fighting at Les Buissons and Buron. He tracked every movement of the Sherman tanks as they pushed southward toward his positions. Division Commander SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt had issued aggressive orders for the day. The situation necessitated speedy action. The division was to attack the enemy and throw them into the sea. The planned hour of attack was midday on June 7th. Witt envisioned a counterattack that would drive straight through to the beaches, splitting the Allied beachhead between Juno and Sword sectors, and creating the conditions for a devastating defeat. It was an ambitious plan that reflected both German confidence in their elite divisions and a fundamental misunderstanding of how precarious the Allied situation actually was. Meyer recognized the plan was unrealistic. The division was still arriving, its units scattered across miles of Norman roads. Allied aircraft controlled the skies, attacking any movement during daylight hours. The fuel and ammunition needed for a sustained offensive had not yet reached forward positions. Meyer countermanded Witt's order on his own initiative, deciding to stop the Canadian advance rather than attempt a suicidal drive to the beaches. It was a decision that may have saved his division from destruction, and certainly saved countless Canadian lives in the process. Meyer deployed his forces with lethal precision. His regiment fielded 3 Panzer Grenadier battalions, totaling over 3,000 men. The critical element was the 3rd Battalion under Obersturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Milius, positioned to strike directly into the Canadian flank south of Authie. Supporting the infantry was the 2nd Battalion of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, under Sturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Prinz. This formation deployed approximately 50 Panzer IV tanks, organized in 4 companies. These vehicles were hidden in concealed positions northwest of Caen, tucked behind ridge lines and in tree lines, where they could engage the advancing Canadians from the flank without exposing themselves to return fire. Additional firepower came from over 50 artillery pieces, including self-propelled Wespe and Hummel gun howitzers. 75mm anti-tank guns from the regimental anti-tank company covered likely avenues of approach. 88mm guns from the 21st Panzer Division's heavy anti-tank battalion operated under 12th SS command, their high-velocity shells capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Nebelwerfer rocket launchers waited to saturate target areas with devastating salvos. It was a formidable concentration of firepower, all focused on the route the Canadian vanguard was following. The Germans held their fire with extraordinary discipline. Meyer later wrote that the battalion maintained excellent fire discipline. His teenage soldiers, many experiencing their first contact with the enemy, allowed the Canadian tanks to advance deep into the killing zone without firing a single shot. The temptation to engage must have been overwhelming. Sherman tanks rolled past at ranges where they could not miss. Canadian infantry walked openly across fields that were perfectly zeroed by German machine guns. Still, the SS troopers waited, fingers on triggers, watching through their sights as the enemy drove deeper into the trap. Meyer's original plan called for a coordinated attack at 1600 hours, but the Canadian advance was moving faster than expected. By early afternoon, the lead Shermans had crested the ridgeline south of Franqueville, placing them barely 200 yards from concealed German positions. If Meyer waited any longer, the Canadians might overrun his starting positions before the attack could begin. He gave the order over the radio net at approximately 1500 hours. The opening salvo was devastating. The 5th and 6th Panzer companies struck the Sherman column from concealed flanking positions, their 75mm guns punching through the thin side armor of the Canadian tanks. 88mm anti-tank guns added their fire to the carnage, their high-velocity shells arriving almost before the sound of the shot. Canadian tanks that had been rolling forward just moments before now stood motionless, flames pouring from their hatches as ammunition cooked off inside. Crews who managed to escape their burning vehicles found themselves under machine gun fire as they tried to reach cover. Sergeant Stan Duke of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders survived to describe what happened next. Within minutes, most of our tanks had been knocked out. Everything happened so fast we never had a chance. The Shermans went up like torches. Explosions first, fire, smoke, and screaming men. The image would haunt him for the rest of his life. Young men he had trained with, lived with, fought beside, were burning alive inside steel coffins while he watched helplessly from the ground. Trooper L.J. Gilbert of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers captured the terror of the moment. Their 88s were really terrible. We had nothing like them. The flat trajectory of the German guns meant that shells arrived almost before the sound of the shot. There was no warning, no time to react, no possibility of evasive action. One moment, a tank was advancing normally, its crew scanning for targets. The next moment, it was a burning coffin for the men trapped inside. Some crews never had time to bail out. Others escaped the initial hit, only to be cut down by machine gun fire as they tried to flee. While the tanks burned, Milius led his 3rd Battalion Panzer Grenadiers in a direct assault on Authie from the south and southwest. The teenage SS soldiers stormed into the village with savage aggression, their assault guns and mortars suppressing the Canadian defenders while infantry worked through the streets. These boys had waited years for this moment, trained endlessly for the chance to prove themselves in battle. They attacked with a ferocity that stunned the inexperienced Canadians they faced. C Company of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders fought until surrounded, firing from windows and doorways as the SS closed in from all sides. The stone walls of the Norman houses provided some protection, but the Germans brought up assault guns that blasted the buildings point blank. French civilians cowered in cellars as the battle raged through their homes, listening to the thunder of explosions and the screams of dying men above them. By mid-afternoon, C Company could no longer hold. The survivors surrendered. The exact number of Sherman tanks destroyed that afternoon remains a matter of historical debate. The Sherbrooke Fusiliers War Diary recorded 15 tank losses for the day. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders War Diary claimed 27 tanks lost. German records from the 2nd Battalion, 12th SS Panzer Regiment claimed 29 enemy tanks destroyed. Modern historians generally estimate that between 21 and 28 Shermans were knocked out, with B Squadron suffering the heaviest losses. That squadron entered the battle with 15 tanks and ended with only 5 fit for action, a 67% loss rate in a single afternoon of fighting. By approximately 16:30 hours, Authie could no longer be held. Lieutenant Colonel Petch ordered a withdrawal to Buron across 1 kilometre of open ground that was being swept by German fire. The retreat was a nightmare. 75mm shells, 88mm rounds, and mortar bombs rained down on the withdrawing Canadians. Men who had survived the fighting in Authie were cut down in the fields as they tried to reach safety. There was no cover on the flat ground, nowhere to hide from the steel fragments that filled the air. The regimental war diary recorded the horror. The enemy then engaged our fire from Buron with 75s, 88s, mortars, and everything they had. Under this fire, enemy infantry advanced and penetrated the forward slit trenches of D Company. It was impossible to stop them. The disciplined retreat became a desperate scramble for survival. Men ran from shell hole to shell hole, dragging wounded comrades, leaving the dead where they fell. The Germans temporarily overran Buron, but a Canadian counterattack recaptured the village. By nightfall, the front had stabilized with the 12th SS holding Authie and the Canadians dug in around Villon-les-Buissons. The spearhead that had pushed 5 miles inland that morning had been driven back approximately 2 miles. Brigadier Cunningham ordered the survivors to consolidate in the brigade fortress position. The Canadians would hold this ground, later known as Hell's Corner, for nearly a month. The Germans had paid a significant price for their victory. Their war diary records 12 Panzer IVs destroyed in the engagement, along with numerous other vehicles damaged or abandoned. Personnel losses totaled approximately 300 killed, wounded, and missing. Among the dead was Sturmbannführer Hans Scapini, commander of the 2nd Battalion 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, killed on his unit's first day of combat. The inexperienced Canadians, as historian Mark Milner has noted, had fought a force 3 times their size to a standstill without artillery support for 7 hours. But the true horror of June 7 was not what happened during the battle. It was what happened after the shooting stopped. As Canadian prisoners were gathered and marched toward the rear, the killing continued. Major Don Learmont, who had commanded the vanguard, described his captors. They were wildly excited and erratic, continually yelling and screeching to one another. I actually thought they must have been taking drugs. The young SS soldiers, their blood still pumping from their first taste of combat, were in no mood to show mercy to the men they had just defeated. Along the route from Authie to the Abbaye d'Ardennes, SS soldiers systematically murdered Canadian prisoners of war. At Authie, groups of Highlanders were ordered to remove their helmets. Then they were shot at close range. Corporal Thomas Davidson was among those murdered. His body was dragged into the street and crushed under the treads of a passing SS tank, his remains ground into the cobblestones, while French civilians watched in horror from their windows. Private Lorne Brown, wounded and trying to surrender, was bayoneted in the chest and abdomen by an SS trooper who pinned him to the ground with his boot as he tried to rise. Lance Corporal Joseph Arsenault was holding grenades out in surrender when an SS officer approached and spoke to him in French. Arsenault, a French-Canadian from New Brunswick, answered in the language of his birth. The officer shot him fatally in the neck. Major Leon Rodenizer, the captured commander of A Company, managed to convince German escorts to stop killing prisoners during the march to the rear. His intervention saved some lives, but he could not prevent what was happening along the entire route, where other groups of prisoners were being led away. The murders were not the work of a few rogue individuals. They were systematic, widespread, and tolerated by the chain of command. At the Abbaye d'Ardennes itself, the killings took on a methodical quality. Military police demanded that 10 volunteers step forward from the assembled prisoners. When none volunteered, 10 men were randomly selected. Sergeant Stanley Dudker, one of the survivors who would later testify at Kurt Meyer's war crimes trial, watched as his comrades were chosen. On the evening of June 7, 11 Canadian prisoners of war were taken into the Abbey's medieval garden. There, in the shadow of ancient stone walls that had stood for 800 years, they were shot in the back of the head. The next morning, June 8th, 7 more North Novas were brought out one by one. Each man shook hands with his surviving comrades before being escorted to the garden. They knew what awaited them. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. They walked to their deaths with the quiet dignity of soldiers who had done their duty. The executions were carried out with machine pistols. The entire process took approximately 10 minutes. On June 17, 2 more Canadians were killed at or near the Abbey. Lieutenant Frederick Williams and Lance Corporal George Pollard of the Stormont Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders became the final victims of the Abbaye d'Ardennes murders. In total, 20 Canadian soldiers were murdered at that location. Across all incidents between June 7 and June 17, the 12th SS Panzer Division murdered approximately 156 Canadian prisoners of war. Historian Terry Kopp has calculated that 1 in 6 Canadians killed fighting the 12th SS died after capture. No other German formation approached this ratio of atrocities against Western Allied prisoners. The killers were products of a toxic combination. Indoctrinated Hitler Youth volunteers, steeped in Nazi ideology, led by non-commissioned officers, brutalized on the Eastern Front, and commanded by officers who saw prisoners as obstacles rather than human beings deserving of protection under the laws of war. Meyer himself was heard telling subordinates that no more prisoners were to be taken. A Polish conscript named Jan Jesionek later testified to hearing these words. Whether Meyer personally ordered every killing or simply created the conditions in which murder was tolerated and encouraged remains a matter of historical debate. What is beyond dispute is that soldiers under his command committed systematic war crimes against men who had laid down their arms and were entitled to protection as prisoners of war. The strategic consequences of the June 7 battle were profound. The Canadian advance on Caen, an original D-Day objective, was halted for over a month. The 12th SS established defensive positions from Authie southward that they held through weeks of bitter fighting. Every attempt to break through was met with fierce resistance. The city that was supposed to fall on the first day of the invasion remained in German hands until July. Operation Charnwood finally broke through on July 8 at 9, 1944. The assault required 467 RAF heavy bombers, dropping 2,000 tons of bombs on northern Caen. The city centre was devastated, its medieval architecture reduced to rubble, hundreds of French civilians killed in the bombardment. 656 artillery pieces fired in support of the ground attack. The Highland Light Infantry of Canada stormed Buron across 2,000 yards of open ground, suffering 262 casualties, including 62 killed in hand-to-hand, fighting against SS troops who refused to surrender or retreat. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders attacked Authie, the site of their June 7 defeat, and liberated it. The regiment's war diary for that day noted the grim satisfaction of returning to ground where so many comrades had fallen. The Regina Rifle Regiment entered the Abbaye d'Ardennes shortly before midnight on July 8th. Lieutenant Williams's body was found in the garden, buried in a shallow grave with other victims. The full extent of the murders would not be known until a proper investigation was conducted months later. The bodies in the Abbey garden were not discovered until December 1944, when a French citizen reported suspicious graves to Canadian military authorities. An investigation team exhumed the remains and documented the evidence of execution-style killings. Shell casings from German weapons were found near the bodies. The victims had been shot from behind at close range. There could be no doubt about what had happened in that quiet garden during the days following D-Day. The lessons learned from June 7 shaped Canadian tactics for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. Fighting the 12th SS required overwhelming firepower. Massive preliminary bombardment became standard before any major attack. Close tank infantry cooperation was emphasized, with tanks providing direct fire support for advancing foot soldiers rather than ranging ahead independently. Canadian commanders accepted that heavy casualties were inevitable when facing SS defenders who would not surrender. The 12th SS Panzer Division was eventually destroyed in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. Trapped between converging Allied armies, the division lost 94% of its armour, nearly all its artillery, and suffered approximately 8,500 casualties from an original strength of over 20,000 men. The Hitler Youth soldiers who had seemed so formidable in June were ground down through weeks of continuous combat until little remained but burned-out vehicles and shallow graves. Meyer himself was captured by Belgian partisans on September 6, 1944. He was wearing a regular army uniform rather than his SS insignia, apparently hoping to avoid the consequences that awaited known war criminals. The partisans turned him over to American forces, who eventually transferred him to Canadian custody. Meyer's war crimes trial at Aurich, Germany in December 1945 was Canada's first major prosecution of its kind. The proceedings lasted several weeks, with witnesses called to testify about the murders at Authie and the Abbaye d'Ardennes. Sergeant Stanley Dudka, who had watched his comrades led away to be executed, provided crucial testimony about the systematic nature of the killings. His account was corroborated by other survivors who had witnessed the selection process and heard the gunshots from the garden. French civilians who had witnessed murders in Authie described what they had seen. Women who had watched from windows as Canadian prisoners were shot in the street gave testimony in halting voices, still traumatized by what they had observed in their own village. German prisoners from the 12th SS provided additional evidence, though many remained loyal to their former commander and offered only reluctant cooperation. The prosecution presented evidence of a pattern of behavior that went far beyond isolated incidents. Over 150 Canadian prisoners had been murdered by the division in a span of 10 days. The killings occurred at multiple locations, were carried out by multiple units, and continued over an extended period. This was not the heat of battle excess. This was systematic murder sanctioned by the chain of command. The defense argued that Meyer had not personally ordered the killings and could not be held responsible for the actions of individual soldiers in the chaos of battle. His attorneys pointed to his combat record, his decorations, his reputation as a soldier's soldier who led from the front. They presented character witnesses who testified to his bravery and his care for his own men. The military court found Meyer guilty of inciting troops to deny quarter and bearing command responsibility for the murders committed by soldiers under his command. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. The verdict seemed to deliver justice for the 156 Canadians who had been murdered after surrendering. Major General Christopher Vaux commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. Vaux judged that Meyer's level of personal involvement was insufficient to warrant execution, though he did not doubt the guilt of the division as a whole. The decision was controversial then, and remains so today. Meyer served 9 years in Canadian and German prisons before being released in September 1954. Cold War pressures contributed to his early release. West Germany was being rebuilt as an ally against the Soviet Union, and keeping former SS officers imprisoned indefinitely complicated that relationship. Meyer never acknowledged any responsibility for war crimes. He spent his remaining years working in a brewery and participating in veterans organizations. He died of a heart attack in 1961, at the age of 51, never having faced justice for the full extent of his crimes. Today, a bronze memorial tablet stands in the garden at the Abbaye d'Ardennes, where 20 Canadians were murdered. The inscription reads that on the night of June 7–8, 1944, 18 Canadian soldiers were murdered in this garden while being held here as prisoners of war. 2 more prisoners died there or nearby on June 17. They are gone but not forgotten. Small maple leaf flags left by Canadian visitors often cover the ground around the memorial. The garden is always open to those who wish to pay their respects. At Authie, a monument honours the North Nova Scotia Highlanders who experienced their baptism of fire in that town and the surrounding fields on June 7th. 84 North Novas and 7 citizens of Authie lost their lives that day. A street corner in southern Authie bears the name Place des Trente Sept Canadiens, honouring 37 Canadian prisoners murdered there. The Battle of Buron monument was dedicated in May 2018 by members of the Royal Highland Fusiliers of Canada, the modern successor to the wartime units that fought there. Most of the Canadian dead from June 7 are buried at Benny-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery or Bretteville-sur-Laise Canadian War Cemetery. Their graves are marked with white headstones bearing the maple leaf and the regimental badges of the units in which they served. Lance Corporal Pollard was never found. His name is inscribed on the Bayeux Memorial alongside thousands of others whose bodies were never recovered. The Battle of June 7, 1944 was more than a tactical engagement. It was a clash between ordinary soldiers doing their duty and fanatics who had abandoned the basic rules of civilized warfare. The Canadians who advanced toward Caen that morning were young men from fishing villages and farming communities, clerks and factory workers who had enlisted to serve their country. They found themselves facing teenagers raised on hatred and veterans hardened by years of brutality. Some died in combat against overwhelming odds. Others died after surrendering, murdered by enemies who had discarded any pretense of honour. Captain Sidney Radley Walters, the young officer who scored his first tank kill that day, survived to become the Western Allies' leading tank ace. He destroyed 18 enemy vehicles before the war ended, had 3 tanks shot out from under him, and earned both the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross. After the war, he rose to the rank of Brigadier General and lived until 2015, passing away at the age of 95. His career embodied what the Canadian Armoured Corps could achieve when skill met opportunity. The men who did not survive deserve to be remembered as individuals. Lance Corporal Joseph Arsenault was 22 years old when he was shot for answering a question in his native language. Private Lorne Brown was bayoneted as he lay wounded and helpless. Corporal Thomas Davidson's body was crushed under tank treads after he was already dead. These were not anonymous casualties. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers, each left behind a family that would never be whole again. Every June 7, memorial ceremonies are held at Authie and the Abbaye d'Ardennes. Veterans, family members, and ordinary citizens gather to honour the fallen. Wreaths are laid before monuments. Names are read aloud in French and English. Prayers are offered for souls who departed this world 8 decades ago. The number who personally remember that day grows smaller each year. Soon there will be none left who can say they were there when the wheat fields turned red. But the memory endures. The monuments stand. The names remain inscribed in stone. And the fields between Authie and Franqueville, where so many young Canadians fought and died on a summer afternoon, continue to ripen each June under the same Norman sun that shone down on them in 1944. They gave their lives so that Europe might be free. They faced enemies who showed no mercy and fought with courage that deserves eternal honour. Some made the ultimate sacrifice in battle. Others were taken from this world by men who had forsaken their humanity. All of them deserve to be remembered. They are gone but not forgotten.